Hi, it's Mrs. Vance again, and this is part 3 of Unit 10 notes about Testcrosses, pedigrees, and human traits. So, in terms of humans or animals that are that take longer to reproduce, or that maybe don't reproduce a lot at one time, how do you figure out what their genotype is based on their phenotype? You can't always do that, and so we've developed something called a testcross, and this is something that Mendel did when he was trying to determine the outcomes of some of his crosses. So a testcross is when you make an individual of unknown genotype and a homozygous recessive individual. Okay, so you have to have one that you know is homozygous recessive for that trait, and then cross it with an individual who shows the dominant phenotype, but you don't know whether they're homozygous or heterozygous. This is going to show whether there is a recessive allele in the unknown genotype. Mendel did this to prove that, of course, that his genotypes were true breeding. Okay, so let's look at the laboratory retrievers again. Labs with normal eyes, and are they homozygous or heterozygous? So here we have, in terms of the color, all right, we have a black dog that we don't know whether they're homozygous or heterozygous, and we have a chocolate lab that we know is homozygous recessive. So there are two possibilities for the black dog. They can either be homozygous or heterozygous. If you cross the individual with the recessive individual, and all of the offspring end up black, then chances are pretty high that that parent is homozygous dominant. If there are any chocolate puppies produced from that pairing, then you'll know that the black dog is heterozygous. All right, and so test crosses are used frequently in genetics experiments of various kinds. Okay, Mendel had a very strong background in mathematics. In fact, he was a math teacher in the village near the monastery. And so he understood about the rules of mathematical probability. All right, and knowing that both of these things were affected by probability, the segregation of the allele pairs and the reforming of the pairs at fertilization. Some things you need to know about probability. We're not going to do much math here, just a little tiny bit. Okay, the probability scale ranges from 0 to 1. An event that is certain has a probability of 1, and an event that is certain not to occur has a probability of 0. And so probabilities are going to be between 0 and 1. Usually we talk about them in terms of percents, things like that. Okay, so we can look at that through a lot of different things. In humans, it's also not very acceptable to do genetic experiments on humans. We're kind of picky about being experimented on. And of course, we have a relatively long generation time, and so it's a little bit more difficult to track some things in humans. And so the way we do that is we look at families. Okay, look at families in terms of something called a pedigree. So if you have there are numerous traits that are considered to be single gene traits, like the ones shown here. Freckles are dominant, and no freckles are recessive. A widow's peak, having hair that comes to a hairline that comes to a point on your forehead, is called a widow's peak. That's dominant as opposed to a straight hairline. And then earlobes, free earlobes, that you can see that are that are not attached at the bottom to the side of the head, are dominant over attached earlobes. Okay. So if you have a simple inheritance of something, the recessive phenotype is always going to result from a homozygous recessive genotype. But a dominant phenotype is going to result from either the homozygous dominant or the heterozygous, like we saw in the testcross. The other term that we use a lot in genetics is something called wild type. Wild type is the more common genotype in the population. And we have a tendency to think that if it's more common, it's probably dominant, but that's not always the case. For instance, in the case of widow's peak is recessive. It's dominant, but it's much less common in the population than a straight hairline is. And we oftentimes in class, when we're in class, a lot of times we'll take a a survey around the classroom of how many people have these different traits, and we'll see. It's a little bit more difficult to do when you're virtual, but we'll see when you're with a group. You can do kind of an informal survey and see how common those traits are. So we can track traits in families through family pedigrees. Okay, a pedigree shows the inheritance of a trait in a family through multiple generations, and it demonstrates dominant or recessive inheritance, and you can also use it to help figure out the genotype of various family members. All right, so here's a pedigree. This is just an example one. This is about earlobes. Okay, and they're using the letter F to stand for the earlobes. Capital F is free, lowercase f is attached. And so the symbols are always the same. Okay, the squares are the squares are males, the circles are females. The line between two shows a marriage line or a parental line, and then the line coming down from that with lines down here represents the children or the offspring of that particular pairing. Okay, so here's our grandparents. We have grandparents. These two grandparents we may not have known to begin with, but they are heterozygous for this trait. And then the other set of grandparents over here, one has attached earlobes and the other one has free, but they're heterozygous. How do we know that? Well, if we start off here and we see these two children of this particular pair of people, we have one child here who has attached earlobes and one who has free earlobes. On the free, we don't really know to begin with whether that person is homozygous or heterozygous until we look back at the family. All right, their parents both had free earlobes. But we know because they have one child that has a homozygous recessive condition that both of these parents have to be heterozygous. So where do they get their traits from? All right, they get them from their parents. So when you look back at the family, the husband in this family, the father of these two children, there were 4 children in his family. He has a sister who is homozygous, who has free earlobes. He has 2 brothers that have attached earlobes, and then he has free earlobes. All right, so that means that both of his parents had to be heterozygous to produce children with those particular traits. Now the sister, we don't know until we look at the rest at her husband and children whether she's homozygous dominant or heterozygous, and we may not ever know. And so when we're not sure, we would put both genotypes here. All right, the wife or the mother has. We know that she's heterozygous because again they had a child with attached earlobes and one with free earlobes. She has a sister who has attached earlobes, and a mother and a father who has attached earlobes. And so we know because she has free ones and her mother had free ones that her mother was heterozygous because the sister here is homozygous recessive. So you can find out a lot of information from a pedigree, and we'll do an activity with pedigrees. The one that we'll do in class is one that we will take a grade on. You will need to pay close attention and read everything in between. All of the answers on the worksheet. It's not a POGIL worksheet, but it's similar to that in the way in that you have to go from one question to the next. Don't just skip from the question to question, but you have to read the information in between. Pedigrees are not really that hard to understand as long as you understand how to read them and follow what's going on. You can use them to determine lots of things about families, about inheritance of traits, and whether something is dominant or recessive, or whether it's related to being male or female, and things like that. And we'll talk some more about it as time goes on. There are a number of inherited disorders in humans that are controlled by a single gene. Okay, oftentimes they are recessive. They're more commonly recessive, I think. In the recessive ones, you have 2 recessive alleles that are needed, and so oftentimes you have heterozygous parents that don't know that they carry an allele for that trait, and then they when they have children and have a child with that disorder, then that's when they find out a lot of times that they're carrying that trait. When you have mating between close relatives, then the probability of inheriting a recessive trait like that increases. There are a few disorders that show dominant inheritance. And so in that case, you only need one dominant allele to show the disease. And ones that are lethal, especially ones that are lethal in early age, are usually eliminated from the population because they don't get passed on, since it takes a dominant allele to get that. All right, so here we have, this is deafness. Okay, so we have two parents who have normal hearing, but they're heterozygous for the deafness allele. Okay, and so they have a 1 chance out of 4 of having a child with normal hearing, the homozygous dominant. They have 2 chances out of 4 of having children that are have normal hearing but carry that recessive allele for deafness, and then we have 1 chance out of 4 that they will produce a child that is deaf. There are other things as well. The most common fatal genetic disease in the United States and many developed countries is cystic fibrosis. This results in excessive thick mucus secretions. There are some other things involved with it as well. The CF allele is recessive. It's carried by about 1 in every 31 Americans. But you have to, could you be tested to see if you have it? You possibly could be tested to see if you have it, but you wouldn't really necessarily know unless you happen to marry a person who is also heterozygous for that trait and have a child with cystic fibrosis. So 1 in 31 is pretty common. We have about 40 virtual pre-AP students, and so probably at least one of you is carrying that recessive allele. Some dominant human disorders include things like achondroplasia, which causes dwarfism, and Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a degenerative disorder of the nervous system, but the symptoms for it do not appear until usually in the mid-40s to 50s, by which time that person has already had children, probably, and possibly passed on that gene to their children. Both of these things that can be tested for. Achondroplasia, if a dwarf with achondroplasia marries another dwarf, then chances are that they will have a child. They have a pretty good chance of having a child that is achondroplasia, but it can also result from a spontaneous mutation. There is a chart in your textbook, Table 9.9, that shows some of these autosomal disorders in humans and how common they are. Notice that a lot of them are like 1 in 100,000, 1 in 22,000, and so forth. Some are more common than others. Okay, sickle cell anemia is about 1 in every 400 African Americans carry the trait for sickle cell anemia or have the condition sickle cell anemia. And there's more information in your book in different places. You'll see over here in the comments, it gives you some reference to some sections in your textbook that discuss those particular conditions. And that's the end of the notes for about pedigrees and human traits.